Hi, Lucy. Good morning. Oh,
Hello, good morning again. Oh, good afternoon, it is
hey,
now.
well, good afternoon for you. So it's great to see you again, Lucy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have this part two of our podcast. I know we discussed we would do a part two, not knowing really how much the environment will evolve, at the time we did part one. So things
Yeah.
have changed, as I think some of us have anticipated. So it's really great to have this conversation with you again, Lucy, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So for those of you who have been following us along, and I'm going to share the link of our previous podcast, in this podcast below, so you can listen to the first version, first session if you have missed that out. Once again, thank you, Lucy, for joining. And on today's session, we're going to cover the most recent FDA developments on the pharmaceutical biotech side of things for advertising and promotion. So first things first, I'm going to
Okay.
start off, Lucy, with basically asking you a very basic question because we may have a mixed audience. There are folks from med device potentially and other parts of the industry that may be watching our podcast that could, I think, tremendously benefit, from your experience with the agency and, of course, with an industry as well. First question, there were some recent developments with the FDA. Could you share what actually happened? What has transpired from the time you and I last spoke, so just to educate our audience.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me back. And yes, things have changed. About 2 weeks ago, the agency did what some people had anticipated might happen, but I don't know that anyone certainly had anticipated it would happen quite like it did. The agency sent a letter to all NDA holders, basically saying that all NDA holders, based in BLA, I believe as well, basically saying that they were going to become more aggressive in their enforcement of direct to consumer promotion. And I want to be really clear because a lot of people, when you use the word DTC or direct to consumer, they immediately go to television. I want to be really clear when they say DTC and when I talk about that or others, we're talking about any promotion that goes directly to consumers. So it doesn't go through the filter or the sift of a healthcare provider. So it may be television, it might be social media, it might be a print ad in a magazine or whatever that's a consumer focused magazine. But this letter was about direct to consumer promotion of any sort and basically said we're going to up our enforcement. And if in fact you have anything out there that is not in compliance with the regulations, you should remove it right now. We're giving you a heads up, basically. I'm oversimplifying slightly just because of time. And at the same time, they said, we're going to show you what we really mean by this. And they sent somewhere in the neighborhood of 49 or so enforcement letters across the industries. Most of them, what we would now call untitled letters. In the olden days, we called them notice of violation letters. Very few, I think 5 total were warning letters, but the rest were enforcement letters. The vast majority about direct-to-consumer television advertising. Okay, but they did address things such as speed of both the scrolling and of the voiceover. They addressed things like the speed of scene changes or the distraction that scene changes might cause in safety. And they also addressed the data requirements for things like quality of life and how rapid things are, how rapid things may work, et cetera. So we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but that's the basics that happened. And it was a wake-up call, I think, that sounded a very loud clarion alarm, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting and not something that we have seen in the recent past, Lucy, this type of an action at the scale from the FDA. So, very, very interesting times, I would say the least. One of the questions I had was for those who are looking for information, I do believe all of this, how much is publicly available for you to look online? We're going to share some links, but I want to hear your thoughts on how much is publicly available at this point in time.
I'm excited you're sharing links. That's great. And let me just respond to what you just said 1 second ago. It is unprecedented. I will just say, at least, I went to FDA in 1992 the first time. I mean, that very first day I was there was in November of 92. And certainly I can say since that time, there have never been any situations where we had that many actions in one day. It is not uncommon to have multiple actions in a day, but certainly nothing like that. So yeah. Unprecedented. In thinking about what's publicly available, I think there may still be a few enforcement letters that were sent that have not yet been posted. But the vast majority of them, both untitled and warning letters, are available right now on the FDA's website. And I think it's important to know that we have posted, or FDA has posted, those letters and made them publicly available since the late 1990s. So you can go back and look at all of the history and all of the letters that have been written, even on these same topics, for that long. But I do believe there could be a few more based on what I'm hearing that have not yet been posted. But when they are, they'll be posted on the same site of the links you'll provide, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. Really appreciate that, Lucy. That'll be super helpful for folks who just want to read up the letters, because there's a lot of learning that you can really gain by reading even 5, of the 49 letters, right? It's a lot of letters to begin with, but even if you read and understood and analyzed even 5 of those, there is tremendous learning involved in the letters. I think that will be super helpful, for the audience as well. One of the other questions I had, and I think is probably on a lot of people's mind as well, is what actually has changed? Like in these letters, do you see a huge change in the type of enforcement and the type of things FDA has, warned the companies about? Is there a difference in the previous warning letters, companies were receiving versus some of these warning letters? Is there like a key difference in the type of standards FDA may be using to actually issue, these types of warnings?
I think I'd like to do 2 things with this one, because it's a little bit of a broad question. But the first one is, I think that what they actually took action on, we have, none of those were a surprise, shall I say. Ever since, the industry started promoting to consumers on television, the FDA has regulated about the safety presentation fairly aggressively. And they have traditionally and always looked at things like the number of scene changes and how rapid they are. Whether I'll never forget one, there was about a woman working in a garden, and she had a floppy hat that moved up and down as she moved. And FDA called that distracting. It took away from the person's ability, the viewer's ability, to actually understand, comprehend the safety, because they were looking at movement instead of listening or watching safety information. So FDA has looked at speed of voiceover. They've looked at movement and times and all that since the beginning, and they've written many enforcement letters over time. They've also put out a guidance in the last several years, the clear, conspicuous, and neutral guidance, the CCN guidance, that talks about some of those issues as well and gives us better guidance. So would I say that there was a lot of difference? And again, about 90% of the letters had to do with television advertising, most of them having to do with safety representation, like speed of scene changes or voiceover speed or things like that. I think those were not uncommon, okay? However, there were a couple of things that were a little bit different. How they categorized perhaps quality of life, as an example, and what that meant and what might be called quality of life as opposed to something that might just be a rather statement of fact. That might be a little bit different in terms of understanding that. And I think we all need to think about that and what that means. But the data requirements for those remain the same. The data has always required to support those a validated scale. And most scales are validated to the total change in whatever it is, not to the individual components. And one of the things we saw here is folks referencing individual components which were not validated. And so the data standard is high. I don't think the data standard changed there, but I think perhaps what they called quality of life and needing data may have been something that's a little bit different that we need to pay a little bit more attention to. Now, the second piece of that, because this is critical, what has changed? There's a lot of misinformation out there right now.
Yep.
A whole lot. A lot of things that are just plain incorrect if we want to talk about false or misleading. And I'd like to take just a minute, because that's part of this answer, I think, to talk about adequate provision, because that's kind of gets at the heart of this and the total safety representation. When our regs were written in the 1960s, okay, I don't think anybody really could predict where we'd be with TV today and all the stuff that would be out there.
Exactly.
But they did talk about broadcast, okay? And in those, they said in the 1960s recognizing the fact that you couldn't slip a piece of paper through the television or radio, okay? Because print ads, remember, and I'm sure everybody that's listening knows, a print ad requires both safety on the ad itself,
right,
and the brief summary has to be attached. And if it's promotional labeling, you have to have not only safety on the promotional labeling, but you have to attach the full PI. So they're two different things, but same concept. Folks need all the data and all the safety there. In television, since you knew you couldn't attach somehow the full PI or the brief summary, because it's not possible to do that, they said in there that you did have to have safety on the ad itself, which in broadcast is called a major statement of safety. And instead of handing it out over the television, you had to make adequate provision for whomever the viewer was to access that brief summary or the full PI. If you couldn't provide the brief summary, you had to provide access to the PI.
right.
So, and in fact, there were ads that were run in the 1980s on television. This historically, most people don't know this. And in fact, they were scrolling the PI like at midnight, trying to meet these requirements.
Wow.
And everybody, the ecosystem came together and said, this is not a good thing for patients.
Yeah.
So maybe we should embargo this until we figure out what adequate provision is. So there was a time in the 90s, and I was there during this time, which is a very an interesting and fun time, where we said, what might meet the adequate provision requirements, understanding what's available today. We had meetings, open meetings, meetings with industry, meetings with consumers, open public meetings. We came up with a draft in 1997, and you've seen it ever since. Because 26 years now that's been there. It's, you know, ask your doctor or pharmacist, ask your healthcare provider, a 1-800 number, a URL, and an ad in a magazine that would be for that you found it. That's what we came up with. Draft in 1997, had lots of comments and listening time, and finalized in 1999. But that guidance was simply to say, this is what adequate provision means today. And if you do all these 4 things, FDA is going to consider that you met the requirement for adequate provision, which was actually provided in the regs in the 1960s. So nothing really has changed in that way. Since then, there's been no other guidance like that till those CCN guidance came along that helped us further understand FDA's expectations for the major statement as well, and how that safety could be represented and what that looked like. And in that one, it basically said, in order to meet this, you have to have the safety both not only in the audio portion, which the original regs required, but also in the video, like like having a chyron or whatever, having it there so that you could see and hear the safety.
Right. That's
a lot, but I want to make sure folks really understand that adequate provision is no loophole per se. It's just another way of making sure folks do get the safety that they need to have.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful, Lucy. Great segue into exactly what I was going to ask you next is there's a mention of 1997. You know, some of us who may have not been doing, you know, or playing this role at that point in time, of course, we have access to the regs and have read the guidance and the CCN, et cetera, in the current day. What was it that triggered them to mention and say that there was the way I read it is something happened prior to 1997 that was being done versus what is being done post 1997 that is missing, right? So that clarification, I think, will be super helpful. If there is something that was, to your whole discussion about adequate provision, is there anything that is missing from pre-1997 that is being added today as a requirement?
Not to my knowledge. Not exactly sure what you mean by that. I mean, I think that I think the FDA in their letter and in their press release and things like that has said that there was more enforcement, you know, back in the 90s than there is today, if perhaps that's, you know, where you're coming from there. And they've talked about all the enforcement letters that were sent out, and now there haven't been any, and, you know, it's just gone haywire or whatever, and there's a lot more. And so they sent all these to show there were things they could write about. I think it's important to know, since I wrote a lot of those letters in the 1990s, and if my name wasn't on them, I saw them, a lot of them. Right. Yes, there were more letters sent back in the 1990s, but what I'll also tell you is those letters weren't nearly as good as the letters that have come out in the last 10 years or 20 years, not by any means. We didn't research, we didn't quote data the same way that they do now. We didn't talk about all of the statistics in those letters in the same way that they do now, in terms of providing information for folks they can follow. FDA has done a lot of research that they then have incorporated into their guidances and have used in their letters to explain to folks why it's important to do certain things in certain ways. So I don't think it's really fair to compare the numbers of letters back then to the numbers of letters today. Right. The quality is so much better in terms of the information that these letters provide for industry, I think, and the data that they quote, that they are better. It's hard to say. There have been a lot of forces. There have been a lot fewer letters, okay, over the last 10 years or so, certainly the last 5 years. Right. What the impacts or reasoning there, I don't know, and I don't want to speculate. But nothing really, I think FDA has been consistent, at least, in their letters. The Zeoman letter, the Ubrelvy letter, the ones that have come out in the last couple of years, have quoted a lot of studies and information and given us a lot. So my recommendation would be to anybody thinking now about what they need to do, look at those letters, look at especially those two, but there's several more that have come out on television in the last 3 to 5 years that I think can be good guidance in terms of looking at expectations, as well, of course, as the CCN guidance.
Excellent points, Lucy. When I think about the quality of the letters, and I look at it just as, let's pretend for a second that we are a layperson, right? An outsider. And sometimes when I watch these ads with my family, right? We're watching TV and somehow there's an ad. You really get to see that the person who knows nothing about, the stuff that we know, when they watch the ads, they really do get, a very different impression of the ad. We are very attuned to looking for what we need to look for when we watch the ads. But a layperson, very attuned to getting carried away with the way the ad has actually been presented. So some of the recent warning letters, to your point, the quality of the letters and the way the observations, that have been made, and each observation being linked to a specific requirement, really excellent analytical work in terms of just learning, right? Exactly to your point. If somebody were to pick up some of the recent letters, I think there's a lot of learning you could gain just by reading through specific things that are being called out, including some of the recent letters, right? Even if I went through some of the ads and some of the recent, just the letters that have come out, very interesting. I do want to touch two things. One is just how people look at this as an external, layperson. Second, you touched on data. I know we talked about data the last time. I think ultimately, it's great that FDA continues to hone in on that specific requirement, because that is the ultimate bar that really creates any kind of, misleading impressions, right? What kind of data is being presented in the letter? So go ahead.
Well, I would just respond to two things. One, I would not necessarily say that all the letters that came out 2 weeks ago are of the same high quality, that the ones I was referencing were ones that came out prior to. Now, some of the ones that came out 2 weeks ago are of the same quality I have come to expect for some time from FDA. Some of those were not, okay? And they were not, and that is somewhat of a concern to me, frankly. I would expect that the quality of the letters that we have seen over the last 10 years would continue as we move forward, creating appropriate expectations, explanations, data requirements, all of those things that are there. And some of them weren't, and I think some of them could have also been change of opinion letters or non-comment letters on advisory opinions that ended up being enforcement. So I'm not saying everything was rosy, so to speak, with those letters that just came out. I want to be very clear about that. But I also want to say that it's a really interesting thought about, what we can expect from FDA. Because I've heard there's kind of been a call to say they need to be more specific then. How many scene changes? How slow does it need to be? That's hard to do for them. I think the CCN guidance may be as close almost as they can get, because all these are nuanced and they're also dependent upon the product in terms of how much safety you need or the therapeutic area or whatever. So I think we need to be thinking about, how can we really put the patient first and think about what we're doing. Is this a pause moment where we can think about what we need to be doing for the patient if the patient is first? How important is television, and how slow do we need to do it? Do we want to do more market research to actually test whether the patients are comprehending the safety or not, if that's important to get that right?
Exactly.
So what role do we as industry play too, as we play these things back and forth? Because there might be another kind of data we could gather, frankly, as industry, to help us do this in a way that benefits our patients even more. I don't know.
Exactly right. And I'm not claiming to have read all the letters that have come out. I did look at some of them, and yeah, definitely some of them do. I have to go through. I think it'll be a really good learning if I get the time to go through all the letters.
And I think you should. I do think you should. And I think that your point is exactly right, no matter what. The
Right.
best way to learn what FDA is thinking is to read all the letters they put out.
Yeah.
Just like lawyers, when they look at precedent, what decisions have judges made, those letters tell us how FDA is interpreting the regulations. So, in my opinion, we should start some kind of a letter club, where we're all reading these letters together and learning. But
I
you're
would.
right. Thank you
I
for
think
saying spot on.
that's a great idea, actually.
Yeah.
See, we should probably, once we find the time, we should do something like that, where we do a letter a week.
I'm in if you want to. We're in.
Right? We should maybe do a letter a week. We'll get through
Okay.
them quickly, right? Some of them are not, like you said, maybe easier than the others, but I think we should do something because it's really educational. Every time I read them, I'm like, they all seem very fundamental, yet there are slips, right? So that is the part. I want to probably, we don't have as much time to go over, a lot more detail. Of course, you're going to be available. We're going to be available for questions, on the web as well. In closing, Lucy, I would love your thoughts in terms of, what guidance, what is the right way to look at what has happened, and what are the key takeaways, industry should be taking from this kind of an unprecedented, activity from the FDA?
What a great question. And maybe if I say that enough times, I'll have enough time to think about it and give you a really smart answer. But I think the bottom line is this. I just really believe, as I've written in my post on LinkedIn, every crisis is an opportunity. And so I would strongly suggest that that's how we see this, not as a knee-jerk reaction, not as an emotional reaction, whatever, but as an opportunity for us to pause for a minute as an industry as a whole and as an ecosystem, all of us, FDA, us, industry, everybody involved, and say, what's our goal? Who do we serve? Whom do we serve? And how do we serve them best? And what is that? And then we think, because there's management and then there's leadership. If we want to manage the television ads, we can figure that out. We can either, put the safety just on a still thing for people to read with a green background or whatever, and they can read it, or we could do the testing and make sure they comprehend it, and perhaps voluntarily submit that with our Forms 2253s. Say, we tested it for comprehension and this works. So we can work on that. But I think the bigger picture too is to take that moment and say, where are we? What's in the best interest for our patients? Whom are we serving? And is television the best way even? Is there another way that perhaps we can serve them better? Or what role does that play in the mix? And how do are we committed to providing the information they need, both the efficacy in ways they understand and is not misleading through data, like the difference in, in how we present percentages as an example, or and safety. Do they really understand that? Because I will firmly believe for the rest of my career that patients do better on our products when they understand truly the potential side effects, as do their prescribers. And the better they do, the better results they get, the more it helps commercially as well. So these things all go hand in hand. And what an opportunity if we see it that way, I think.
I totally agree, Lucy. Also, we have an entirely evolving patient community, which was very different back in the day to what it is today, right?
Right.
I think it really behooves the industry to absolutely pause, understand why this action was taken, what are the benefits? There's always an upside. Every time, something happens, I think there's always going to be an upside and a learning from it that you can actually use to transform, some of the previous practices, right?
You're so right. And patients today don't want to be sold. They want to be informed and supported, I think, don't you? I just hear you. It's a different patient out there today than it used to
Exactly. And that has to be catered to, right? We can't take the
be. Yeah,
previous format and try to fit it to the current environment. And with all of the social media, I don't think we can actually just do, copy paste like was being done before. I mean, it's always a pleasure, Lucy. I really
my
appreciate
pleasure. Thank
take the time. I think your wisdom is, goes really, so many different directions for the community. So really appreciate you taking the time to have this call. I know there's a lot of concern and, potentially really, I think a lot of companies obviously are trying to figure this out. But I think through true partnership, collaboration, and with the right intent, I think we are absolutely all headed in the right direction, right? I do believe that this happened for a reason, and the reason is always to look at the patient and put the patient first and see what we can do better. Exactly. You said it, much more eloquently than I did, where patient comes first. What can we do to serve the patient much more better than we were doing before? So
Yeah.
again,
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for
thank,
having me.
of course, Lucy, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and we'll be in touch. Thank
Thank
you
you so
again.
much. Take
Yeah,
care. Bye
take care.
now.
Bye.